It has been more than 2 years since I made a map video of Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess, and you guys have been begging me for the next video mapping Skyward Sword. Okay, well, one person might have just asked randomly in the last month or so, and now it's finally time. The main reason behind this gap was because I was waiting very patiently for Skyward Sword to be released on the Switch so I could capture it all in beautiful crisp HD. The reason why it's taken since July for me to make this video is because I've been lost out here in the woods. But I think now is as good a time as any for me to just get really stuck in, look at the map of Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild, and see if we can find anything from Skyward Sword scattered in the vast world that we see in Breath of the Wild. Now, who's screaming? Now, just a really quick disclaimer, okay? I know that Breath of the Wild was created, the map was all formulated to include as many references as we could to other games to tug at our nostalgic heartstrings, but I'll just ask you to please suspend your cynicism just for the next 15 minutes or so while we dive into this theory that I've come up with, and just be open to this idea. So to make this video, again, I had to redraw all of the maps from Skyward Sword, and I had to go through and make a few tiny adjustments. I'll talk about that here now. First of all, in each region I had to make a little bit of artistic, take a little bit of artistic license just to get everything to match up, because the maps in Skyward Sword, in some areas they stack up on top of each other. So you'll see this in Farren Woods, where Lake Floria sits underneath the main part of the woods, and I had to create this tiny little track here just to make them sit on top of each other properly. Again, in Elden Volcano, for the crater, I had to create this tiny little track between the Elden Volcano and inside the crater. Who is driving around at this time of night? It's ridiculous. And then finally in Lanaru Mines, I had to make this little detour down here to get to the Lanaru Caves, just to make sure everything there matched up. So that's the only things I've changed with the maps. Otherwise they look pretty much exactly like the artist representation. If you zoom right out in the Skyward Sword map and you see the little images of each area, that's pretty much what it looks like. Also, just something to keep in mind, the time frame between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild is never fully explained in the game. The story gives us the vague timeline of 10,000 years after Ganon was sealed away by Link and Zelda, something that happens about half a dozen times throughout the series. The difference is that this particular event alluded to includes an army of guardians and the divine beasts. You already know all of this, but I think a context of this time is important. We also only see a very small portion of the surface in Skyward Sword. We see the forest, volcano, and desert biomes. Biomes? I've been playing way too much Valheim. I've said this in previous videos, but I think that the layout of Skyward Sword, these foggy parts between the maps, is exaggerated, and that they actually lie much farther apart than what is depicted here. And that's what we're going to be going with anyway. So let's start with the names of the locations and see where they could match up with locations that have the same names in Breath of the Wild. Farron, Elden, and Lanaru. As this game likes to be lineal, we will be too, and start with the Farron region. Located in the southeast of Skyward Sword, Farron matches up well with its Breath of the Wild counterpart. With this configuration, with due north pivoted 36 degrees to the west, the sealed grounds overlays Guccini Plain and Guccini Barrows. To the south, the once deep reservoir that was fed from the waterfall that protected the ancient cistern has sedimented into the shallow Heron Lake.
Moving east into Farren Woods, the western side, which was already lower down in Skyward Sword, has been further caught in a subduction zone over the years and is now divided between Farren Woods and Great Plateau. Lake Floria from Skyward Sword matches with the Breath of the Wild counterpart in this configuration. The underground waterways to Farron's chamber have eroded away and become exposed as Floria River, and the cascading waterfalls that surround the deep lake from Skyward Sword have also worn away in the edges over time, becoming the intricate and expansive Floria Falls, comprising Korta, Rodai, and Kalora lakes as well. Moving to the north, to the deep woods, Skyview Temple comes to rest in the lee of the southern twin of Dueling Peaks, and the large chasm to the east of this portion of the map vaguely follows what becomes Tobio Hollow. One thing I discovered while I was editing this video is that my placement of the Farron province is a little bit off when compared to the layout of the artwork for the Skyward Sword map. In particular, the sealed grounds is a little bit too close to Farren Woods when compared to this piece of work. So what I've done is just slightly adjusted the sealed ground and moved it a little bit further towards the west. When making this adjustment, the sealed grounds now overlays the Highland Stable on the Feral Plain and is less than half a day's walk away from the Great Plateau.
It's not the best fit in my opinion, but it is nice to see Lake Floria link up in such a complete way.
Assuming that is that this body of water kept the same name through various calamities and ages. Something to note that's visible in Skyward Sword is that over time, names of areas can change. For instance, the sealed ground 10,000 years prior was known as Hylia's Realm. After Demise was sealed away, it then became known as the sealed ground. So just bear this in mind that names of places can change depending on certain events.
Let's move to the Elden province.
With the same application of pivoting to the axis of the North Pole by 36 degrees, we get an interesting match. The Earth Temple aligns with the summit of Death Mountain, the crater too. And the Fire Sanctuary spans out over Lake Darman on the northern edge, perhaps lost in some catastrophic eruption between the two ages. This one I also give a bit of a pass because volcanoes can drastically change so quickly over a short time, so I'm not too fussed that we don't find an exact match. And I'm quite happy for this to kind of be the norm for the rest of this video going forward, so expect to see configurations like this for the Elden province.
That brings us to our last province, Lanaru, which is a tricky one.
Mapping over its namesake in Breath of the Wild instantly ruins the layout of the province as seen from the sky above. That means that Lanaru in Breath of the Wild moves between the other two provinces, whereas in Skyward Sword it sits in the southwest. This further supports my suggestion that names of locations have swapped around from time to time. However, we'll continue with this current theme of mapping in the named locations, and then revisit that other idea that this province could actually be somewhere else in Breath of the Wild later on. So let's start with the main desert area. Keep in mind that this area was, at a time before Skyward Sword's main timeline, a lush biome. The first thing that strikes me is the clear pattern of the mine. Its pattern matches really well with the outline of Zora's domain.
So this is pretty weak to start with, but just bear with me a moment.
So let's place this here and then just look to the west of this area, where the original Temple of Time can be accessed by passing through a tunnel and into the canyon area. This matches really well with Trilby Valley. The Trilby Highlands was also the name of an area immediately west of Hyrule Castletown in Minish Cap, which took place after Skyward Sword in the timeline. The significance of the royal family's chosen crest atop the original Temple of Time, and the link between Trilby Valley and the Trilby Highlands, as well as this ruin north of Zora's domain that matches up with the location of Hyrule Castle in Minish Cap, all point towards a possible connection. This could have been the first iteration of Hyrule, once the mines were started back up, if water was struck, or the goddess Naru decided to bless the descendants of Hyrule by spawning a fountain that became the reservoir. I know I'm clutching at straws now. To achieve this layout, I've actually had to turn the map the opposite way to the others as well. And the sand sea, which we know can be wet or dry, does lie nicely over the wetlands, and these underground sections of Lanaru Gorge could lay under Zodobob Highlands to this day. However, the Lanaru Canyon sits awkwardly upon Rabia Plain, so that doesn't really work out so well.
So let's move on, shall we? Instead of matching Lanaru with its namesake, let's match the terrain with terrain that we see in Breath of the Wild. Let's just assume that Lanaru was never able to get rid of its adverse climate change issues that it was having in Skyward Sword, and it eventually became what many assume as Gerudo Desert.
In this scenario, we again can pivot at 36 degrees to match the previous two provinces, which I'm sure you'll agree already match with some environmental conditions. If we place the mine over top of this interesting quarry called Gerudo Canyon, which looks a lot like the Gerudo Canyon from Ocarina of Time, a few things line up. Stelry Plateau aligns with the landing point when you first enter Lanaru, and the chasm that leads to Lanaru Caves matches perfectly with Yana Valley. The Lanaru Canyon also matches up with and encircles the terrain around the southern Zonai Labyrinth, which I think is quite nice, and the Temple of Time protrudes over the rock shelf that later becomes Gerudo Desert's gateway. Perhaps it eroded away over time and got lost beneath the sands. The Sand Sea also now matches with the encroaching desert, which could have easily swallowed all of the relics of the past. With the Temple of Time destroyed, Nehru may have abandoned this area, or perhaps the Hylians who first came to the surface and discovered this area may have found out that it had once been a lush area filled with unique flora, and renamed similar lands of the north after the same place and vowed to do better, making efforts to ally with the Zora and protect the waterways so that it wouldn't become an arid wasteland. Maybe.
All of these theories miss out on one key element.
Something that you learn when you first start Breath of the Wild is that the Great Plateau is the birthplace of Hyrule. It is also said that the Sealed Temple was rebuilt as the Temple of Time. We even find a Hylia statue inside the Temple of Time on the plateau in Breath of the Wild. All of this heavily implies that the plateau is the sealed grounds. So let's assume that they scaled down the ancient statue that fell from the sky. Let's be real, it must have sustained some kind of seismic damage in that fall and become unstable. So, much like the limestone on the Great Pyramids, Hylia's stone edifice may have been whittled down away to a mere shadow of its former glory, and the offcuts used to build the foundation of a new temple. Hylia would still be facing north, the direction that she faces in both games. That would mean that the Farren Woods becomes this grassland area, just nestled between Scouts Hill and Eastern Abbey, south of the outpost ruins. Lake Floria widens as the waterfalls around it wear down the rock and eventually slow to a trickle. Perhaps in generations to come, people follow the source of that river and thought that they rediscovered the original Lake Floria, surrounded by waterfalls deeper in the jungles and again to the southeast. This mountain to the west of Lake Hylia is even called Mount Falora. Is that name derived from Lake Floria, or is it just a coincidence? And this closer body of water was renamed after the goddess who sealed away demise, Lake Hylia. Over time, the deep woods are hacked away to make room for roads and outposts, and Skyview Temple falls into ruin, as did the ancient cistern as it crumbled into Lake Hylia.
Both of these temples were lost beneath the debris and weight of time, eventually being forgotten, just like the ruins of Troy on the Hellespont in Turkey. One day it may be uncovered again, like the ruins of Göbekli Tepe, and no one will know what purpose it served. Maybe. Another very common fan theory, and it's one I don't really support, is that the statue of Hylia from Skyward Sword that falls to Earth is the same statue that's in the Forgotten Temple in Breath of the Wild. I don't think, there are some compelling links that people have put together, but I personally don't think that these two are the same. So it may take a little bit more of a stretch of the imagination than I've already asked you to take, but for the sake of covering all of our bases, let's have a look into it.
The goddess statue in the Forgotten Temple faces to the south, so let's align the sealed grounds to match that view. This place is Farren Woods in the middle of the Tibantha tundra. While it's possible that somewhere beneath the ice sheets is a frozen lake and a petrified ancient woods, or that Skyview Temple is buried somewhere near Kopiti Drifts, I highly doubt it. My main reason is due to the scale of the goddess statue. The statue that you see in Breath of the Wild is vastly smaller to that from Skyward Sword. There are slightly smaller things that I'll talk about, like the fact that there's that little missing cubbyhole that you put the little Loftwing statue in at the top. But that and the fact that it's now buried underground, this alone with the unlikely placement of everything else that we see in the Farron province is the reason why I'll abandon this theory here.
So where does that leave us? It's pretty inconclusive at the moment. There's a couple of okay theories, but I have one that I want to share with you guys that I think is probably the most likely.
In the far north of Hyrule, there is a place called Akala, one of the most interesting areas in Breath of the Wild. Deep in the hills of Akala, between the Ordok Quarry and Rock Woods, you'll find the Spring of Power. This spring matches perfectly with the spring located in Skyview Temple from Skyward Sword. So, let us begin there. If we overlay Skyview Temple and the Deep Woods, we align them with this road from Shadow Pass to the North Akala foothills. This chasm matches with the depression that falls away to the east of Akala Plains. Where Farren Woods once stood, we now have the bleak slopes of Ulri Mountain slipping away into the Torren wetlands. Similar to how deforestation on Easter Island has caused issues with erosion, the diverse formations of Farren Woods have eroded away over time with the removal of the trees that had supported this ecosystem. Floria Lake aligns with the Torren wetlands and Lake Akala. The waterfalls that feed the lake have receded over time towards the southern Akala Falls. The ancient cistern lies buried somewhere underneath Akala Citadel. From here you can still see the deep dell in which it once stood, protected by a mystical waterfall, now dry and covered in silt from the eroding landscape. And the sealed grounds where Demise once met his end are now buried unassumingly under what is now a stable, somewhere at the foot of Akala Citadel. In this configuration, if you stand on the precipice in Farren Woods and look out over Lake Floria and Skyward Sword, which may one day become Lake Akala, you can see the Akala waterfalls flowing down from the highlands around Zora's domain. To the southeast you can even see a mountain that could be Mount Lanaru, and beyond that to the west you can see a mountain that could one day become Dueling Peaks. To the west of you, which is the most important point, is a large volcanic mountain. Death Mountain. The fact that this mountain is placed extremely close and to the west of Farron weakens the theory that the woods could sit over top of Farren Woods in Breath of the Wild. I know people talk about seismic activity causing magma vents and volcanoes shifting over time and that sort of thing, but what we're talking about is the space of 10 to 30,000 years. For this mountain that you can see here to become a mesa, like the ones around the Gerudo Desert, over that time is extremely unbelievable. I'm sure that mesas are formed by glaciers eroding away softer materials around monolithic stone, whereas volcanoes and mountain ranges are formed by the collision of tectonic plates and magma vents shooting up from between them.
I realise that something I mentioned before may challenge this theory a little bit.
The first being that King Rome states that the plateau was the birthplace of the Kingdom of Hyrule, and that the second being that Hyrule Historia makes a claim that the sealed temple was renovated to become the Temple of Time in Ocarina of Time.
So let's look at both of these claims.
First of all, the claim that the Great Plateau is the birthplace of the entire Kingdom of Hyrule. This claim comes from a segment of text that the old man on the plateau says when you first meet him.
What he actually says is, according to legend, this was the birthplace of Hyrule. According to legend. So just bear that in mind.
It is completely possible that the first settlers arrived in Akala as the location of the sealed grounds, but after venturing out into the wider surroundings, later found that constant storms and being adjacent to a rather violent volcano, as well as the roaming packs of wolves and moblins and whatnot, that they may have decided to begin a migration to a more suitable location, similar to the legend of Moses and the Hebrews' journey to the Promised Land. That second point about the Temple of Time being created over top of the sealed temple, This belief comes from a small blurb in Hyrule Historia. What that book actually says is, it is thought that Rauru built the Temple of Time directly over the ruins of the Sealed Temple.
Again, it is thought. Like, okay, that's a really nice Easter eggy little tidbit to put in a book that somebody's going to buy for $50 or whatever, but it is thought. It doesn't solidify anything. This statement has become embedded in the fandom to the point that everyone just takes for granted that the Sealed Temple is the Temple of Time from Ocarina of Time. Even like with some fans, the fan wiki for example, the Zelda wiki, going as far as to say that the Sealed Temple has the same layout as the Temple of Time in Ocarina of Time.
Okay, sure, whatever.
Which it happened to be built over. Nowhere in any game or any of the publications does it specifically say that. It says, it is thought to. So, okay, sure.
I feel that the evidence for the Sealed Temple and the Temple of Time being one and the same is equal to, if not lesser than, the evidence that it is not, particularly that neither the Sealed Temple or the Temple of Time appear in the Minish Cap, which is meant to sit between Skyward and Ocarina. We're also forgetting the fact that there is already a Temple of Time in Skyward Sword, and while its layout is drastically different to Ocarina's, one feature it does have is the symbol that becomes the crest of the Hylian family. So what I've done is given the map the same 19-degree pivot as the Farren Woods did in the previous configuration and placed the Temple of Time from Skyward Sword over its counterpart in the Great Plateau. It's not the greatest comparison. The chasm around the entrance to the Temple of Time kind of matches up with the lower area of the plateau where this tower rises up, and the mine complex would have had to be completely dismantled. And then if we assume that the canyon doesn't link directly to the Lanaru caves, but that tunnel doubles back a little bit, then it could sit nicely over the Zonai ruins in Farron, which I like because it links the Lanaru dragon, who was a thunder dragon, to the Zonai in this area, which is kind of themed after electricity. I mean, how many times did you get struck by lightning while exploring around here? If we take that same theme, that the tunnels from the Lanaru caves can span greater distances, then the Sand Sea could still sit here in Gerudo Desert as well, or even span further south into the actual sea. Now that's an interesting idea. Going with my Ocarina of Time video, one could argue that the Hylians were able to restore parts of the Lanaru Desert to its former glory, and that the desert was slowly reseeded and terraformed, so it's sort of like what we see in Dune. Spoiler alerts if you haven't read the books. So that in Ocarina of Time it looked like this, and then by Breath of the Wild it was mostly back to normal. That's if you like the idea of the Temple of Time remaining exactly where it stood in Skyward Sword. Another theory I have revolves around that crest of the royal family of Hyrule appearing on the Temple of Time. The first settlers to Hyrule may have seen this strange, mysterious monument and it became an area of worship, and then they went out and built their first kingdom of Hyrule. And again, for those who like the idea of the kingdom starting on the Great Plateau as legend has it, this could still have happened. The castle in Breath of the Wild may have been built hundreds, if not thousands of years after Ocarina of Time, after Ganondorf destroyed the castle in that adult timeline. So perhaps after Ocarina of Time, there was a little bit of a second migration. The people of Hyrule went out looking for another place to settle and returned to where they first found the crest for the royal family, to find that what was once a desert has returned back to a lush green area that's ripe for tilling and turning into farms and building a big castle on top of. So if we take Lanaru province from Skyward Sword and overlay it over what becomes central Hyrule, you get a few interesting links. These depressed sand sinks line up with what are now rivers. The metal from the abandoned mine and its ancient technology, not to mention these monolithic mining robots left to rust, could have been harnessed to build the first Guardians, and then went on to create the Divine Beasts. What was once a vast sea and then became the Sand Sea may have again returned to fertile soil, but that also explains why there are deposits of rock salt all over the land. The Lanaru province was taken over by colonialism, and the names were swapped around and changed. So the border for the Lanaru province was pushed across the area to the land in the east, and this realm was then renamed as Central Hyrule.
Or maybe none of that happened. Maybe it's just a video game, and the whole map was just created for fun, for you to explore, and all of this has been a big waste of your time and mine. I'm cold. I want to go back home. What I do know is that I enjoyed making this video. And if you enjoyed watching it, and if you want to see more videos like this, or even videos that are not like this, you can check out my channel. I'm about to make a video about how I made a desk, which I use to do all my editing and filming when I'm not stuck out here. I just released a video recently of how I made a secret bookshelf door, and I'm planning to make another video like this looking at the maps of Breath of the Wild and other Zelda games and see where they could fit in. At the moment I'm weighing up between whether I do A Link to the Past or the very first original Zelda game, so let me know in the comments which one of those you would like to see, or if you want to see something else that I haven't explored here. But for now, that's all for me. I'm gonna get out of here because I can hear something crunching down in the woods behind me, and I don't know if it's a deer or just a hedgehog, but I'm starting to freak out that I'm gonna get rammed in the back by a stag, so I'm gonna check out now. I'll see you guys later.
Also, if you line up these circle bits from the Lanaru mine with these circle bits from Hyrule Castle that form the road in the town, and then you rotate it this way, and bing bang boom, the canyon where you meet the Thunder Dragon aligns with the Thunder Plateau. And therefore, this video is now over.
I wanna taste your content, hold your breath and feel the tension. Devils hide behind redemption. Honesty is a one-way gate